Contingency arguments for God's existence go back thousands of years, and because of this, there have been many formulations of the argument put forward. While I believe most of the formulations are successful, I believe the formulation developed by YouTuber Cameron Bertuzzi is best. The formulation in defense of the premises is inspired by the works of philosophers Alexander Pruss and Richard Swinburne. Links to their works in the description down below. The argument itself goes like this. Premise 1. Necessarily, every set of contingent concrete objects possibly has an explanation for why it, rather than some other set of objects, exists. Premise 2. L possibly has an explanation for why it, rather than some other set of objects, exist. Premise 3. No contingent object in the actual world could explain L. Premise 4. If no contingent object in the actual world could explain L, and premise 2 is true, L is possibly explained by a necessary being or a group of necessary beings. Premise 5. If L is possibly explained by N, then N exists. Premise 6. If N exists, God exists. Therefore, God exists. As you can see, the argument itself has a lot of technical language, so let's break it all down before defending each premise. Contingent objects are objects that exist in some, but not all possible worlds. For example, the books on my bookshelf exist, but it's logically possible for them not to exist, meaning the non-existence of my books entails no contradiction. On the other hand, a necessary being is an entity that exists in every possible world. For example, the number 1 exists in every possible world. This is because the proposition 1 plus 1 equals 2 is true in every possible world, since it's a logical contradiction to say something like 1 plus 1 equals 4. And if a proposition is true in every possible world, then its truth maker, the things that make the proposition true, must exist in every possible world. Hence, the number 1 is a necessary being, since it exists in every possible world. However, the contingency argument makes another distinction between objects, that is, between concrete and abstract objects. Concrete objects are objects that can engage in causal relations. So, my computer, your phone, my foot would all be concrete objects. Abstract objects are objects that do not engage in causal relations. Examples would be numbers and shapes. With that vocabulary lesson over, we can carefully analyze the truth of each premise of the argument. Now, with respect to the first premise, necessarily, every set of contingent concrete objects possibly has an explanation for why it, rather than some other set of objects, exists. I want to bring everyone's attention to the weakness of this causal principle. Premise 1 is not saying that every set of contingent concrete objects has an explanation for its existence, only that it possibly has such an explanation. So everyone who already accepts stronger causal principles, like the principle of sufficient reason, should automatically accept this premise. In order to refute this premise, the skeptic has to show that it is impossible for a set of contingent concrete objects to be explained. Since no demonstration has been attempted, as far as I'm aware, there is no reason at all to deny the first premise of the argument. Denying premise 1 also seems to undermine science. Science is built on trying to develop the best explanation for some set of observations. If it were the case that some contingent concrete objects don't even possibly have an explanation, how do we tell which set of objects has an explanation and which set do not? How do we know which scientific endeavors will be fruitful and others fruitless? The denial of premise 1, therefore, destroys all motivation to seek scientific explanations, since we have no way of knowing if violations of P1 are improbable, if P1 is false. For these reasons, it seems reasonable to accept premise 1, and thus premise 2 as well. But what about premise 3? Well, since L includes every contingent object in the actual world, it can't be explained by a contingent object not included in L. A member of a set cannot itself explain the entire set. It would have to be explained by something outside of L. In other words, something non-contingent. This brings us to premise 4. If L can't be explained by a contingent object outside of L, which it clearly can't, it follows that the explanation for L must be non-contingent, i.e., necessary. And remember, N must also be concrete because it has causal power. Abstract objects do not have causal power. Now we come to premise 5. This step relies on modal logic. If the set of all contingent objects in the actual world is explained in some possible world by N, then N exists in some possible world. And if a necessary being exists in some possible world, that being must exist in all possible worlds. Remember, necessary beings by definition must exist in every possible world. So if a necessary being exists in one of the possible worlds, it exists in all of them. Now we come to the hardest premise of all to defend. If a necessary being exists, why does this being have to be God? Well, I think with some further reasoning, we can infer this being is both infinitely powerful and deeply personal. By power here, I mean creative power. That is, the ability to create and change contingent objects. With that in mind, consider the following. For any set of contingent concrete objects X, there is another set of contingent concrete objects Y that requires more power to bring about than X. To see why, let's suppose there's a possible world where 5 apples exist. This world would take more creative power to bring about than a world where only 4 apples exist. And the world where 5 apples exist takes less creative power to bring about than a world where 6 apples exist, and so on. The point is this: there is no set of contingent objects that is most difficult to bring about. There is always a possible world that takes more power to bring about. Now, if that's true, and N is finite in power, then N will eventually reach a set of contingent concrete objects that it fails to bring about. However, N must be able to possibly explain every set of contingent concrete objects as per premise 1 of the original argument. Therefore, N must have infinite power. Or to put it simply, if N had finite power, we would eventually get to a world where there were too many contingent concrete objects to be possibly explained by N. However, premise 1 said such a set would have a possible explanation, so we reach a contradiction. So N must have infinite power. We can reach the same conclusion by reasoning another way. If N had a power limit X, for example, then X seems to be a contingent property of N. For any power limit X, it is conceivable for N to have power X plus 1. The conceivability is strong evidence of logical possibility. And if it's possible for N to have the power limit X plus 1, then N's power limit is contingent, but there can't be any explanations of N's contingent properties outside of N. However, according to 1, N's contingent properties are possibly explained. We, again, reach a contradiction. Therefore, N must be infinite in power. Now let's move on to volition. We have established N has infinite power, but why think N isn't an agent with intentions? Well, I think volitional agency is the only thing that can account for how a necessary cause can produce contingent objects. Think about it. If N is simply an impersonal mechanistic process, then if the process necessarily occurs, then the effect should also necessarily occur, meaning contingent objects cannot exist. But N must account for the existence of contingent objects. Therefore, N cannot be a mechanistic explanation. But what if N explains probabilistically instead of mechanistically? N would explain in terms of exemplifying a probabilistic function. So N would have X chance of producing the contingent concrete objects in the actual world. This option seems to explain how a necessarily existent cause can explain contingent objects. However, a deeper analysis renders this pathway completely unmaintainable. If N explains probabilistically through exemplifying a property, then this implies that every contingent concrete object that exists purely because of random chance. In other words, we live in a purely chance universe. But the trouble doesn't end there. Remember, N must be able to possibly explain every set of contingent concrete objects, and there are infinitely many logically possible sets of contingent concrete objects. So the chances of N producing the set of contingent concrete objects in the actual world, and not any other set of objects, is 1 out of infinity, which completely breaks the entire concept of probability. Thus, N cannot explain probabilistically. That leaves only one alternative. N must explain personally. That is, N must have volitional agency and have the free will to choose which set of objects to actualize. Now, some might object to this by saying that if n is capable of volitional action, then there is some ratio r of worlds in which n performs action A. So then, n fixes a probability equal to r that A occurs. Hence, n has a probabilistic fixing property of P that specifies the probability that A occurs, which is circular. However, Josh Rasmussen points out that n can exemplify P in virtue of the way it acts, without it being the other way around. In that case, any probabilistic fixing properties n exemplifies would be explained by whatever actions n would or would not perform in whatever circumstances in which n might find herself, which ultimately means that no vicious circle ensues. Let's recap. Every set of contingent concrete objects possibly has an explanation for its existence. Hence, the set of contingent concrete objects in the actual world has a possible explanation. This explanation must be necessary, since a contingent concrete object cannot explain its own set, nor can abstract objects. Since this necessary explanation exists in some possible world, this necessary explanation exists in all possible worlds, including the actual one. The necessary explanation must be infinitely powerful, since it must possibly explain every set of contingent concrete objects, and be personal because it explains contingent objects. Therefore, there exists an infinitely powerful, necessarily existent mind. This mind is what we call God, therefore God exists.